Thank you. I also want to point out that we have sitting over here Nava Hefetz, our educational director, who does wonderful work for us in the educational field, and perhaps she might be tempted to answer some of the questions also later on. We are, this evening, Erev Yom HaZikaron, our Israeli Day of Remembrance. We're also here in the period of Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer, also a time of semi-mourning, but not only, because the time of the Omer is a time that we count the days from leaving Egypt, which we celebrated on Passover, to Matan Torah, till the time that we receive the tablets at Mount Sinai. And what we're here to talk about tonight is Torah. And we're here to talk about what it is that we as Jews believe and stand for, what we as rabbis swore to uphold when we were ordained. Now, of course, we're also told Shivim Panim LaTorah, there are 70 facets to the Torah. There are even those who say that at Mount Sinai, each and every person heard something a little different. And so, when we talk about upholding Torah, different people see that in different ways. But the Torah that I learned growing up in Erie, Pennsylvania, was a Torah that said a basic part of what it means to be a Jew is to be concerned with universal human rights and social justice. This is what I learned from my family, from my teachers, from my rabbis, from the community. And I think that's something that I imagine a lot of you here, those of you who are from the Jewish community, can identify with. I think it's a piece of what our ethos is as North American Jews. In fact, one of the most interesting findings of the most recent North American Jewish population survey, I'm sure many of you know, is that of all the different possible measures of Jewish identity, that aspect which with more Jews in North America identify with than anything else, which give more Jews in North America pride in their Judaism than anything else, is the connection between Judaism and social justice. And so I think we can have our quibbles and quabbles about the right balance between universalism and particularism. We have people that talk the talk without walking the walk. And of course, once we start talking about Israel, as we will tonight, then everybody's buttons get pushed. But whether you're talking about Erie, Pennsylvania, or Brooklyn, New York, I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find many people in the North American Jewish community who would dispute the proposition that these are core Jewish values. And so when I first spent some significant amount of time in Israel, my first greatest shock, and I'm dating myself a bit here, was to find out that bagels were not readily available. What kind of Jewish state is this without bagels? No problem anymore. But the second greatest shock was to find out that many people in the Israeli community did not necessarily see these values of justice and human rights as axiomatic in the same way that I had learned, particularly in the religious community. You know that Israel is a very lively democracy. We had some 27 parties in the last election, each of them getting state-funded television time. There is a wide and full opportunity for people to express opinions, and many Israelis share many of the values and ideas that I'm going to speak about tonight. Most of them tend to be secular, whereas in the religious community, for a variety of historical and sociological reasons, and this was not always the case, but increasingly people have been socialized into a somewhat volatile mixture of extreme nationalism and particularism. One of our rabbis, his daughter went to B'nai Akiva, one of the Orthodox youth movements, and she met her husband-to-be when there was a vaguely liberal speaker, and they were the only two people that clapped their hands at the end. And that's how they met each other. So that in Rabbis for Human Rights, if our first mandate is to address and redress human rights abuses, then our second and no less important mandate is to introduce into people's intellectual universe, not only in the religious community, but also in the secular community, where many people assume that this nationalistic, particularistic brand of Judaism is the sole authentic brand of Judaism, because that's what they see reflected by the people who for them are the authentic representatives of religious Judaism, to introduce into people's intellectual universe that alongside this dominant understanding of Torah, there is an equally Jewish, equally textually based, humanistic, equally authentic humanistic understanding of Torah. One of my clearest memories from my first year working for Rabbis for Human Rights back in '95, it was in December, just a month after Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. And we went for a morning of study at a yeshiva in the occupied territories by the name of Birkat Yosef. The Birkat Yosef is headed by a rabbi who had been quoted on the radio as saying that bombs should be placed on the side of the road to prevent withdrawals from territory. And he's one of the rabbis who was suspected, and I really underline the word suspected. I don't know how many journalists and lawyers we have here, but suspected. It was never proven, and he denies it. But had been suspected of being one of the rabbis who had given a halachic, a Jewish legal backing for the assassination. And so we spent the morning studying with the students, and then we had a round table with the students and ourselves and Rabbi Rabinovich. And one of the first things that he needed to say was just what seems so basic to all of us. What is it that we learn in the very first verses of Genesis, of Sefer Breshit? That all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image, and that therefore Judaism cannot and must not condone the oppression or humiliation or mistreatment of any human being. But then we started talking about details, and then we got into trouble. So we were talking about some things going on in the Hebron area at the time of oppression of Palestinians by settlers or by soldiers. And Rabbi Rabinovich was saying, you haven't seen it yourselves. Unfortunately, we had. You're getting it from second and third hand sources, etc., etc. And then one of Rabbi Rabinovich's own students stood up. And he said, Avakvod Arav, but Rabbi, when I was doing my army service in Hebron, I saw it with my own eyes. Now, of course, at that point you could have heard a pin drop. And I wish I could tell you the end of the story was they all signed up that day to be members of Rabbis for Human Rights. It didn't quite happen that way. But that student did come to see us again, and I think we did introduce into people's intellectual universe, as I said, another way of understanding Torah. Rabbis for Human Rights was founded during the first Intifada. In fact, many of Israel's current human rights organizations, ourselves, B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights, Workers' Hotline, and many others, were all founded during that period because when the orders had gone out to put down that first Intifada by breaking bones, there were many people who simply felt that red lines had been crossed. And particularly among our colleagues, rabbinic colleagues, many people who hadn't been particularly political or activist or left-wing simply felt that there was a need for a Jewish rabbinic response to what was happening in our society. And our founder, Rabbi David Foreman, wrote an open letter saying to the chief rabbinate saying, why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned with Sabbath observance and kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws? These things are, of course, very important. But where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels running around this country and crying Gewalt and speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society? For those of you from the name of Rabbi Heschel does not ring a bell, he, of course, was a descendant of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent most of his career at the Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote wonderful books on Jewish philosophy and history, and people should read those books. But he didn't just stay in the ivory tower. He was one of the first people to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He was one of the people behind the scenes that led to Vatican II. He was very active in the struggle against the Vietnam War and on behalf of civil rights. And he, in many ways, is our role model of a rabbi and scholar who is also a social activist. And as I said, this call struck a chord for many, many, many rabbis. And we quickly became, unfortunately to this day, we are still the only rabbinic organization in Israel in which rabbis from the different streams of Judaism, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Renewal, all coexist in one organization without strangling each other. And so I understand from the response that people understand that in Israel that's no small feat. That of course, just for that we should get some brownie points somewhere, because in some ways the gaps between different Jewish groups in Israel are at least as wide as those between Jews and Palestinians. In fact, it was so unusual at that time to do what we were doing that all we had to do was show up someplace where a human rights violation had taken place and all the press would come. It was kind of like man bites dog, basically. And it's not so easy anymore, but we are the recipients. We received the Speaker of the Knesset's Prize for our contribution to Israeli society. And we've been endorsed here in North America by the rabbinic associations of the Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movements. And we are supported also just by, as I said, by hundreds of rabbis really around the world, particularly here in North America. We work sometimes through the courts, sometimes lobbying in the Knesset or in the government with the government, sometimes through direct advocacy, sometimes through media campaigns, and sometimes, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, through acts of civil disobedience. On principle, we are always working on at least one issue which is dealing with the human rights of Jewish Israelis, and at least one issue which is dealing with the human rights of non-Jews who are also a part of our society. So that today I would say that there are many, many issues we work on, and many issues we would like to work on if we had more person power, but our three main pillars today are, first of all, education. I mentioned that Nava directs our educational programs. We go into Israeli schools and we teach about Judaism and human rights, and we also have been developing materials on Islam and human rights. We do teacher trainings. We've been creating a Talmudic-style commentary on Israel's Declaration of Independence. You know that in the Declaration of Independence, which has legal standing in Israel, there is a bold vision of human rights and equality. Unfortunately, many people, particularly many young people, just don't know what's in that document, and we'd like that to change. One of our most exciting developments of this past year is that we've set up a human rights yeshiva, a Beit Midrash, where university-age students receive a stipend to study an evening a week texts, Jewish texts dealing with human rights. and then also doing a field placement with Rabbis for Human Rights or with another human rights organization. And frankly, when the idea first came up, I wasn't sure it was going to work, or it was going to take time. Where were we going to find students that would want to do this? And we've been overwhelmed with more students than we planned for, who want to know and talk about human rights and want to talk about it. And the students that we have range from secular students to students that grew up in the yeshiva world. And they want to study about the connection between their Judaism and human rights. Rabbis for Human Rights believes that economic justice is a human rights issue. You know, the advice I get when I come on these speaking tours, just talk about the Palestinian issues. People will love you or they'll hate you, but that's what they want to come and hear. Well, we will talk about those issues, but for us in Rabbis for Human Rights, the Israeli single parent opening up that empty refrigerator is just as important as the Palestinians who we go to help them harvest their olives. And you know that some 20 years ago, Israel had one of the smallest gaps between rich and poor in the entire world. Today we have the second largest gap in the Western world. And with that, we have many, many, many challenges. And particularly with the economy that's been deteriorating since the beginning of the Intifada in particular, and with the downturn in the global economy, those issues of how we divide in a just and Jewish manner a shrinking pie are incredibly important. You know, I in addition to my daughter, I always seem to have bad timing when choosing when to come and do these tours. Right now, as some of you may know, Israel is debating, the Knesset is debating yet another economic plan. Up until a year or so ago, what we said was that before income transfer payments, child support, welfare, what have you, that 1 in every 3 Israelis would be living in poverty, and after those payments, the number was about 1 in 6. That number changed from 1 in 6 with the passage of the 2003 budget to 1 in 5. And if the proposals that are on the table right now are passed, it will be 1 in 4. 1 in every 4 Israelis will be living in poverty. 1 in every 3 children. Imagine that. And what particularly makes this a Jewish issue, to my mind, is that this is all based on simply what I would call lashon hara, what we call the slander or the evil tongue. There's this idea, and does the Wisconsin plan ring a bell with some people here? And I was reading an article in the New York Times today about what's happening here in Oregon. It's the same idea. It's the best of American culture. The idea that, well, you know, most of these people that are the over 300,000 Israelis who are now unemployed, well, the fact is most of them are just faking it. It also reminds me of the Reagan years and welfare queens driving Cadillacs and this kind of thing. It is simply hair-raising. I sit in Knesset committees with representatives of the Treasury, and there people are asked. They ask, well, what's going to happen when you cut out the social net from underneath people? Well, not to worry, because they're all faking it. As soon as there's no more social net, they'll go and get a job. And so we are facing very serious issues about how to divide a shrinking economic pie. When we begin to move over the green line and talk about Palestinian issues, if I were to try to trace a thread connecting between most of our major projects in the occupied territories, it would be the fact that when the Oslo process began, wittingly or unwittingly, and there are people both on the left and the right that say that Oslo was a bad idea from the get-go. I'm not one of those. But what happened is that a parallel process was created, whereby both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, already back in 1993, were looking forward to final status negotiations and asking themselves, how can we improve our negotiating position for those final status negotiations? How do we create facts on the ground and keep the other side from doing so? Now, as has already been mentioned, we are a human rights organization. We are not a political organization. What we do is political, of course, but we're not political in the sense that we don't belong to any party, that we don't have our maps and our proposals for where the borders should be and what to do with Jerusalem and these kinds of things. We deal with much more narrowly focused human rights issues. And so we certainly acknowledged that the elected leadership of the Israeli people and the Palestinian people have the right to negotiate as they see fit, for whatever they see fit, whether Arik Ascherman or anybody else in Rabbis for Human Rights likes it or not. But we have a human rights issue when you say that the ends can justify the means. And in all too many cases, unfortunately, we can see that during the Oslo period, that there were instances in which Israel violated human rights for the sake of a negotiating goal, which was more or less that if we remember that Oslo divided the territories into areas A, B, and C. A being total Palestinian control, B being Palestinian control but Israeli security control, and C being total Israeli control, and still to be negotiated over. So Israel felt that if, to the degree that there could be Israeli presence in these areas and to prevent Palestinian presence in these areas, then it would strengthen Israel's bargaining position at the negotiating table. Once again, it's not an issue of whether we agree or disagree that Israel has a right or had a right to negotiate for some of these territories. The question is the means. So, for example, we've been working on Bedouin issues. The Jalaline Bedouin, for example. You take Bedouin groups and you herd them into reservations, more or less, so that the rest of the area that they were living on can be freed up for Jewish development. The issue that many people have heard about, because by the way, whenever I say we, I usually mean we in coalition. We're a small organization. But we, in this case, as part of the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions, succeeded in making an internationally known issue, the issue of home demolitions, that catch-22 situation, where that in addition to security-related demolitions, where the majority of demolitions in the last 10 or so years have been a result of the fact that Israeli policy makes it virtually impossible for a Palestinian living in Area C or in East Jerusalem to get a legal building permit without paying a bribe underneath the table. Almost impossible. And it has nothing to do with planning, it has nothing to do with security. You can have a clean security record, you can have uncontested title to your land, you can stand on your head. And if you're Palestinian, you're not, in most cases, going to get that building permit. And so when you are then forced to build without a permit, you've now built an illegal home, subject to demolition. Thousands of homes have been demolished that way, and thousands more are on the chopping block. And the real reason, once again, is to keep those areas free of Palestinian presence. Let me go back to a third example. The cave dwellers of the South Hebron Hills. I know it may be difficult to conceive of the fact that in 2003 there are people living in caves, but there are. And believe me, many of them would rather be in those caves than out in the middle of an Israeli winter with no roof over their heads. And yet, precisely, for example, in November of 1999, Israel expelled 700 men, women, and children from their caves. Thank God, this raised a terrible hue and cry in Israel. 7 of Israel's top authors and poets wrote an open letter to then Prime Minister Barak, saying this is not in the spirit of the Israeli army that we grew up with. And eventually, in a victory for Israeli democracy, the High Court sent those people home. But to this day, we are fighting in court this issue because the government keeps on trying to reverse that decision. And you ask yourselves, what's the point of all this? You go out to these caves, and you're in the middle of nowhere. These wind-swept, forsaken hills. If my car could sue me for taking it places that no little Honda Civic was ever meant to go, first and foremost among those would be these South Hebron Hills. I don't even have a full gas tank. It's been so banged up. You're not even going over dirt. It's just pure rock. And so why fight over this when you're getting such a black eye, not only in the international community, but in Israel? And then you take a look at the maps, or you pay attention as you drive out there, and something clicks. Remember that one of Barak's ideas, which once again we can agree with or disagree with, was to redraw the borders to include major settlements inside Israel proper and then give the rest back. And sure enough, what you notice when you look at the map is these caves are only a few kilometers from the Green Line, from the 67 border in the south near Arad. And without these few pesky cave dwellers, you have a Palestinian free peninsula of land from the Green Line through some of the South Hebron Hills settlements to Kiryat Arba, one of the larger settlements. And sure enough, later on, we saw that on Barak's maps. Once again, you can agree or disagree whether that's a worthy negotiating goal. But to send 700 men, women, and children out into the cold because of that, that's a human rights violation. Now, I want to go back to the issue of the home demolitions for a minute, and just give you the bad news. I want to give you some of the good news as well, which is that from about September, October of 1998 until midway into this Intifada, basically there was a drastic drop in the number of home demolitions, and in Area C it came to practically zero. In June and July of 1998, home demolitions were taking place at a pace of some 1 to 2 per day. Peter Lerner, the spokesperson for the civil administration, was quoted in the New York Times as saying that this is just the beginning of a major operation. There'll be hundreds more on the chopping block. And in July of 1998, as we were preparing another demonstration, we got the word that homes were being demolished. And we diverted one of our buses to Anata, where the Shawamre home was being demolished. We had a member of Knesset on the bus. It didn't do any good. One of our rabbis who was on the bus, an elderly man, who literally couldn't come down the steep hill to where this was happening, literally had people shot on his left and on his right. And another one of our rabbis says that to see all this happening in front of his eyes, to see the violence, to feel so helpless and powerless, To go back home to Jerusalem where life goes on for everybody as if nothing had happened because for them nothing had, was the absolute worst day of his life. And then he goes on to say that the absolute best day of his life was when in an act of civil disobedience we came and rebuilt that home. We rebuilt the Shwamwe home, and some of you probably have met Salim Shwamwe, the first time on the 3 days leading up to Tisha B'Av, the day in our Jewish calendar where we remember the demolition, if you will, of our two temples which once stood in Jerusalem. And of course, for a family that's seen its home demolished in front of its eyes, that's every bit the personal family tragedy as the national tragedy which we remember on Tisha B'Av. Ironically, that home was demolished the second time the day after Tisha B'Av. We rebuilt it, it's been demolished, and we rebuilt it, and it's been demolished. But the point is that the publicity around that first demolition and rebuilding brought the issue to the attention of Israelis and around the world. I had my 3 minutes of fame on CNN. What's left to do in life after that? And it's important for me to say that we've had some successes. Because frankly, the work that we do is not fun. As an Israeli, as a rabbi, as a Jew, as a Zionist, I get absolutely no pleasure out of standing up here and talking about the deepest, darkest corners of Israeli society. Those aspects of Israel which any of us who love Israel would rather pretend don't exist. But of course they do. What sustains me is firstly the belief that God put us on this earth for the purpose of tikkun olam, for being God's partners in the ongoing work of creation, of repairing and sanctifying the world. And when I know that there are Israelis who have a better standard of health care today than they would were it not for what we do, and that there are Palestinians who will sleep in their homes tonight, that would have no roof over their heads were it not for what we do. And I'll tell you one other thing that keeps me going. It was the summer before last, and I got the call that homes were being demolished in Shuafat refugee camp. Some 14 homes in all were destroyed that day. And I went out, stood in front of the bulldozers, got dragged around and my shirt ripped and arrested and taken in and interrogated. On the way home, after being released, I got more bad news from the South Harpeth Hills. And it was simply one of those days that you just say, why? What's the point of it all? Couldn't a nice Jewish boy find something better to do than stand in front of bulldozers? And then I got back to the office and I started opening up the mail. And there was a letter there from a religious school at a synagogue I had visited a month or two beforehand. They saved up, of course, their tzedakah pennies and sent us a contribution. It wasn't going to make or break our budget. But the letter said, "Dear Rabbis for Human Rights, we are sending you this money because we think it's important to make peace between peoples. We hope you appreciate it. Your friends Aviva M. and Chelsea C." I don't think it was Chelsea Clinton. I just sat in the office and cried. I just lost it. And I wrote back to them afterwards and said, not only did I appreciate it, but you reminded me of why I'm doing this, why we are doing this. We are doing it because we think it's a just and Jewish thing to do, because we think we have an obligation to help people when we can. But we also are doing it because, sometimes I feel people in Israel stop me on the street and say, "You're saving Judaism for us." Because both here and there, we realize that we have an obligation to be a role model for what Judaism can and ought to be. So now we come to the subject that I'd rather avoid, Intifada. Second Intifada. It's so emotional and it gets all of us going. I'd rather avoid the issue, but of course you wouldn't let me out the door if I didn't talk about that, so I will. Not many people know or remember that when the Second Intifada broke out, there was a debate between Israel's two main security agencies, its military intelligence agencies rather. The Aman, the Army Intelligence Unit, gave the interpretation that most of us know, because that's what the Israeli government has found convenient for us to advertise. The idea that this was all planned by Yasser Arafat and the PA, that he didn't get what he wanted at Camp David, he came home and planned an intifada. What few people remember is that the other major intelligence agency, the Shabak, said no, this was all spontaneous. And I think if you've been listening to what I've said over the last few minutes, you'll understand why those of us who were working on the ground with Palestinians didn't need to hear this debate, that in fact, I'd been warning for a year and a half before the Intifada broke out that it was going to happen. Because the handwriting was on the wall, as they say. Simply put, you know, that in the year or so before the Intifada, I don't know how many times the PA tried to organize days of rage and they fell on their face, most of them. And that in fact, when the Intifada started, it was in fact seen, it was later co-opted by Arafat. And I certainly am not here to defend Yasser Arafat. But that in the beginning, many people saw it really as a rebellion against the PA. And just as many Israelis had become more and more disillusioned with the peace process because the PA had been unwilling or unable to stop terror, Palestinians who saw the ongoing land confiscations and expropriations, whether it was Netanyahu or Barak, and the ongoing tree uprootings and demolitions and unfair water allocation, leaving many families in the West Bank in the summer and fall with 2 hours of running water a week, when next door there could be a settlement with a swimming pool and green lawns. All these things said to Palestinians, rightly or wrongly, this is not a peace process. And it's not going to go anywhere, and even if it does, by the time it does, I'm not going to have anything left. Now, anyone who picked up our statement on the crisis outside knows that we are very clear in Rabbis' Human Rights in terms of our condemnation of Palestinian violence. It's both immoral and, frankly, when historians write about this intifada, it will be seen as a setback, I think, in many ways for the Palestinian people. And that's what I say not only here, but to Palestinians when we meet and talk, or when I speak in the Palestinian media. But we as Israelis need to take some responsibility for our actions which helped create the Intifada. But now the Intifada is a reality. And so the question is, by the way, I'm not going to go into all the litany of all the human rights violations that are taking place. There's a lot of propaganda on both sides. I'll simply say that to get the most in-depth and detailed and accurate and unbiased information, I recommend going to the B'Tselem website, www.btselem.org, and it's all there. But we are in Intifada now, and people are dying on both sides. And what do we do about it? Well, first of all, I want to say that if you haven't, I often do a little exercise with Israelis There's a saying in the Talmud that every single Israeli child can quote to you. If someone is coming to kill you, get up early and kill them first. Judaism is not a pacifist religion. But then I ask people, how does the Talmud continue? And then I get blank stares. Because of course we then learn about the rodef, that if someone is chasing after somebody with a knife to kill them, once again, you are obligated to kill the pursuer, also not only to save the pursued, but to save the pursuer from him or herself. But if you could have stopped that person by any other means, by shouting, by shooting him in the foot, whatever, and you kill that person, even though you were only trying to save a human life, you're guilty of murder. In other words, there's a doctrine of minimum necessary force. And then the Talmud goes on to teach us the story that a man comes to Rabbah and says, the strong man in my village is going to come and kill me if I don't go kill an innocent third person. What should I do? And Rabbah, who also was one of those who said, go and kill the person coming to kill you, get up early and kill him first, regarding the innocent person, said, then let yourself be killed. Who's to say that your blood is redder than his? You can't, even to save yourself, you can't kill an innocent person. And I go through all this simply to say that even in terms of intifada, in times of intifada, in terms of violence, in terms of real dangers, and there are, and let's not sweep that under the table, but even when there are real dangers and people who are seeking to kill us as Israelis, there must be some red lines between self-defense and collective punishment in terms of harming innocent people. Now, of course, that's not easily line to draw, intellectually or emotionally. Intellectually, if you haven't been there, let me give you an example. We in Rabbis for Human Rights have had an olive tree campaign for the last 2 years. We've collected over $100,000, mostly from the North American Jewish community. We've used that to replant trees that have been uprooted. We've sent people out to be human shields to help Palestinians harvest their olives. We've helped market oil to Israelis. And people hear about this and sometimes they say, what, are you guys crazy? People are shooting behind those trees. People are throwing rocks from behind those trees. How can you go and replant those trees? Well, first of all, as bad as the Palestinian economy is, you'd have to be very emaciated to hide behind these little saplings that we're planting. But more seriously, yes, that argument makes a lot of sense if you're sitting in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, not to mention Portland or Wichita. But if you were to go with me into the territories, and remember, I'm one of the handful of Israelis, not in uniform, not a settler, that goes into the territories these days, I would show you where trees were uprooted by vigilantes, not by the security forces. I would show you an article by the commander in charge who says, I tell them to take out 10 and 20 trees are taken out. I would show you where trees were uprooted far from any road, clearly not a security issue, where some trees were uprooted and others were left next to them. Why were these dangerous and these not? I would show you where uprooted trees provide more cover than the tree did when it was standing. I would take you to a place called Deir Istia, where there was a real security incident. An incident which I don't make light of for a second. An Israeli woman was seriously injured by a stone, thrown apparently from behind the trees. And so the question is, what to do? And the army wanted to come in and take out 1,500 trees along the side of the road. A few brave activists stood in front of the bulldozers, got arrested. Bought time. It went to Israel's high court. Thank God, once again, we have a high court. And there, under legal scrutiny, all of a sudden the army changed its tune. They didn't need to take out 1,500 trees. They needed to put in an observation post, which in the end required taking out about 10 trees. So in other words, there was a real security issue. There was a real defense need, and that cost 10 trees. And then there were another 1,490 trees for collective punishment. But you have to go there to really understand that. And if intellectually that's a hard line to draw, just imagine how difficult it is emotionally. You know, during the this last olive harvest season, which I just mentioned, for the once again, we had a great success. For the first 2 weeks of the season, when we sent out volunteers to act as human shields, the army, when people were coming to steal olives out of the Palestinian olive groves, or when we were being intimidated or beaten or shot at, the army either wasn't showing up or coming late or standing by. And then as a result of pressure we were able to put on from different directions, after about 2 weeks there was a sea change, and I only have good things to say for the most part about what the security forces were doing. They started doing their job. They started arresting people. They started protecting people. They started fulfilling their obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention. But I understand that soldier who was saying to himself, I've lost a loved one or an army buddy, and now you're sending me to go defend these people, to defend their human rights? That's an emotionally difficult thing to ask of anybody. I remember one day being out in the territories in one village, and it was there were some international volunteers, and on the radio there had just been a terror attack, so be careful. And sure enough, they went out to investigate where there was some shooting, and they got detained, and I got detained when I just went to see if they were okay. And then in the police station, this amazing scene, these two women, the police officer wants to give them tea and cookies, and two other officers saying, don't do that. How do you do that? Who's going to give tea and cookies to the 5 murdered Israelis? But as difficult as it is, there's a midrash. There's one of our commentaries on this story. Remember the story of Hagar and Ishmael, banished into the desert and dying of thirst, and God prepares a well and saves them. But the midrash says that before God prepared that well, the angels came and said, don't do it. Don't you know all the problems that the children of Ishmael will cause the Jewish people throughout history? Why not just let it end right here? Let them die. And God says no. God, of course, knows that no future is inevitable. And God, who knows that everything is subject to change, and God who says, right now in front of me is an innocent child. And as difficult as it is, we too must make that distinction. The last thing I want to talk about for a minute or two before opening things up to questions is about hope. Opinion polls show that there's a sane majority of both Israelis and Palestinians who want a negotiated compromise settlement. And an even larger majority on both sides that believe that there's nobody on the other side to talk to. And then you have that strange fact of human nature that people tend to harden their positions when they're being shot at. And both sides are being shot at. And so there's no incentive to make steps to move toward the other side, because people have no hope that it's going to make anything any better. On both sides you have people say there's nobody to talk to. I have Israelis that say, I was prepared 2.5 years ago to go back to 67 borders, and I'm not anymore, because I don't think it's going to get us anything. And so how do you begin to restore hope that there can be a different future? How can you start to create some cognitive dissonance in these seamless worldviews where we all so much see ourselves as the victims that we cannot say that we can be victims and at the same time victimizers? One of the things that we've done over the last year or so is we've created with Palestinian, Christian, and Muslim religious leaders an interfaith declaration in the spirit of the Alexandria Declaration, but more sharply worded. I don't know how often people say to me, it's wonderful there are rabbis for human rights. Where are the qadis and sheikhs for human rights? And so now they're signing this document, and people say that there are qadis and sheikhs that are willing to condemn violence on both sides. And the idea is that maybe that will create the cognitive dissonance that will allow people to hear our message on the Israeli street and vice versa on the Palestinian street. Because we must restore hope. And we must learn the lessons of the past. We, Palestinians, must learn that violence does not augment negotiations, but destroys the possibility of successful negotiation. And we as Israelis must learn that you can have whatever generous or not so generous proposals you want to put on the table that you wish, but you can't negotiate on one hand and violate human rights on the other hand, because that also is a form of violence. I'm not going to get into what comparing and this and that, but the point is that that also makes it impossible to have an atmosphere for successful negotiations. So my hope and my prayer is that we find the way. We find the way to do what I think is the true Zionism today. You know, I often, or not so often, but from time to time I get the death threats. And the people that say we're traitors and we're harming Israel in some way. And if it wasn't so serious, I would almost have to laugh. I don't know how many times, for example, I've gone to rebuild a home that's been demolished and the family has insisted on bringing the children out to see us. They want the children to meet us, and like deja vu, it's the same conversation time after time. Our 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. Our 10-year-old son has just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. And what do we say to our 10-year-old child when he says, I want to grow up and be a terrorist? We want him to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes. That there are also Israelis that come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild those homes. And that breaking down of stereotypes is a part of creating hope, of creating a better future for all of us. And that's why the true Zionism today is working for an Israel which is not only physically strong, but which is morally strong, and which lives up to our highest Jewish values. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Executive Director of Rabbis for Human Rights, Rabbi Arik Ascherman, speaking at the Neve Shalom Synagogue in Portland, Oregon, on May 5, 2003. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer part of the presentation. Founded in 1988, Rabbis for Human Rights describes its mandate as twofold. Alongside efforts to prevent human rights abuses, Rabbis for Human Rights endeavors to introduce an authentic and humanistic understanding of Jewish tradition and sources into Israel's public discourse. While the increasingly dominant nationalistic and particularistic understanding of Judaism echoes loudly, Rabbis for Human Rights gives voice to the tradition's concern for the stranger and others vulnerable within society. To find out more about Rabbis for Human Rights, please visit their website at rhr.israel.net. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Rabbi Ascherman spoke at the Neve Shalom Synagogue in Portland, Oregon on May 5, 2003. The first question for Rabbi Ascherman was about the impact of the work of the International Solidarity Movement in the occupied territories. In the months just previous to this presentation, several ISM volunteers had been targeted by Israeli security forces. Tom Herndahl, a British photography student, had recently been shot in the head by an Israeli Defense Forces sniper. He later died. Brian Avery, an American ISM volunteer, had been shot and severely disfigured barely a week earlier. And Rachel Corey, another American ISM volunteer, had been crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer the previous month. In addition, the British filmmaker James Miller had been shot and killed in Gaza just 3 days prior to Rabbi Ascherman's talk. This member of the audience asked if Rabbi Ascherman expected these events and the ongoing work of ISM to make it harder for Rabbis for Human Rights to get into the West Bank or Gaza.
ISM, of course, is the international solidarity movement. People have been increasingly targeted. A number of ISM people have recently either been killed or seriously injured. And since the latest suicide bombing in Tel Aviv, conducted by apparently by two people with British passports, there is now a discussion of having all international volunteers expelled from the territories. We as Israeli activists and international activists each have our strengths and weaknesses. Up till now, they have in some senses had more mobility than we have, because there's areas in Area A, for example, where we're not allowed to go into. On the other hand, we obviously have more of a common language with our fellow Israelis. If there are no more international observers, it's going to mean more work for us. It means that we're going to have to find a way of taking on some of those tasks in getting to some of the places where we haven't been able to go to, or have felt that perhaps internationals had less risk in going to. Okay. I will try. Has there been any situation in history that parallels the Israeli-Palestinian conflict which we can learn from and or draw hope? I think every case is sui generis. I don't think you can draw parallels, exact parallels, between one situation and another. But I think there have been many cases in history. Let's take France and Germany even. Who would have believed 50 years ago or 60 years ago that France and Germany could be living peacefully with each other along their borders, and it happens. And so I think that there are absolutely examples in history where the human spirit and wisdom and the Spirit of God can help us to overcome our understandable anger and pain that's encrusted over the years, and create a better future for all of us. Okay. I apologize, we had a little glitch and we don't have as many of our materials out here as we had wanted, although you do have the information for Rabbis from North America. There's a number of questions here about website and whatever. Our email is info@rhr.israel.net, and everybody that signs up tonight will get on our snail mail and our email lists. We send out materials. We also, from time to time, send out urgent action bulletins by email. Does Brit Tzedek work together with Peace Now, and in what way? Perhaps somebody from Brit Tzedek can answer that later on. Our website is www.rhr.net. The name of the rabbi, scholar, and social activist was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He wrote The Sabbath, God in Search of Man, countless titles. Essays in a Time of Crisis. What's someone help me, the first part of the title of that book is Essays on Social Issues. Man is Not Alone, that's another one of his philosophical works, but it's... sorry? Right. That was a book written about it was a collection of his writings. I think that was the one by his daughter, Susanna Heschel. But there's something, I'm blanking on it right now, it's something, Essays in a Time of Crisis. All right. Different responsibilities for the occupier and the occupied. After 31 years of brutal occupation, why are the Palestinians required to accept colonization of their ancestral homes? Is there a group of Palestinian leaders equivalent to rabbis that support the issues concerning human rights? Social justice, human rights, ethics are part of Judaism core. Is it a core issue for them? The Palestinians apparently do not recognize a historical footprint by Jews in the territory now called Israel. Please comment on how the state of Israel can agree to peace with the people that harbor these beliefs. Do you think that you could find a single Palestinian that would defend your home or your olive trees? Will you still defend the homes scheduled for demolition of terrorist families? There are absolutely, and you'll see their names on this declaration, there are individuals and organizations of Palestinians who have similar values to ours. I thank God that I don't need to put to a test whether or not there are Palestinians that would defend my olive trees or my home, but I absolutely believe that some of my colleagues and friends would. There is a great amount of denial in certain parts of Palestinian society about the historical link between Jews and the state of and the land of Israel. It's also addressed in our interfaith declaration, where we all call on all to recognize the roots that we each have in this land. The question from a little bit from the other side, in terms of, is there symmetry between occupier and occupied? There, of course, is not symmetry in all kinds of ways, and we could all, but it is true. I would just simply say that I don't. There is a lot of symmetry in the ways that we build our worldviews. There is not symmetry in the sense that Israel is the dominant economic and military power, and in that sense calls the shots more than the Palestinians do. But a word about occupation. You know that we in Rabbis for Human Rights tend to avoid explosive language and words that just divert the issue, divert the conversation from the real issues. And until half a year or so ago, we hardly ever even mentioned the word occupation. We talked about issues going on that one could clearly see were connected to the occupation, but we didn't so much talk about the occupation as occupation, and that's changed. And I want to tell you about two experiences that changed that for me. The first was just a year ago, I was one of the first and only Israelis that went to Jenin after the Israeli army withdrew in defense of Shield. I went incognito. If I wanted to come back in one piece, it would not have been a good idea to be identified as an Israeli that day. My driver was at some scary moments. There was one point where someone, because I do appear sometimes in Palestinian media, thought that he recognized me, and my driver was saying, no, you must be mistaken. You go to Jenin, and you're just blown away. This entire city block, which has not only been reduced to rubble, but to powder. And whatever reasoning may be in your head, it flies out, and you just say, my God, what have we done here? You know, the Palestinians I spoke to there were some of the first to tell me that there hadn't been a massacre. In fact, they were the first to tell me, and I wrote about this at the time, that the army went great lengths to try to persuade people to leave their homes. But at some point, after 13 soldiers were killed, they said enough. And knowing that civilians were still in some of those homes, they brought down the fire and the brimstone. And you can only wonder, was there an Abraham somewhere along the line of command saying, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? I hope there was, but I suppose we'll never know. To meet a woman there, they've just pulled the wheelchair out of the rubble of her son and explaining that she tried to say he couldn't get out so quickly, they didn't care. To read the accounts that appeared in the Israeli press of the bulldozer driver with one hand on the throttle, the other with a bottle of whiskey, trying to do as much damage as he could before he was stopped. But then you do stop a minute and say, what were the alternatives? There were people in there that wanted to murder Israelis. Should we have let them go? Should we have surrounded the area like we did in Bethlehem? Should we have gone house to house and risked more Israeli soldiers? I think we made the wrong choice. But the point is, the moment that those were your choices, it was already a lose-lose situation. It was already kill or be killed. There were no good choices. A few months after that, I get a call at 11:30 at night. A baby has been born at home, a Palestinian baby. People give birth at home. They can't get through the roadblocks, certainly not at night. People die at roadblocks. The baby was born with birth defects and was going to die if we couldn't get her to the hospital in a couple hours. And I, along with someone from Physicians for Human Rights, we worked for the next couple hours. We got the baby to the hospital. As what all was going on, though, we heard about another 3-year-old little girl who wasn't so lucky. They'd been trying for a few days to get her permit and didn't, and she died at home. Now, there was no Israeli commander or politician sitting somewhere saying, let's kill some Palestinian babies. It's not comparable to the suicide bomber that straps on that belt with no other intent but to go and murder people. But nevertheless, Israeli policy that night led to the death of one little girl and seriously endangered another. And then again, what were the options? Why are those roadblocks there? And you realize it's not that there were no problems. It's not that there wasn't any violence or conflict before the occupation. And frankly, I think it's incredibly naive for anyone to believe that everything's going to be fine once the occupation's over. It's not going to be so simple. But within the context of occupation, it's kill or be killed. It's like two roosters put in the ring to fight. Within the context of occupation, Israeli policy will always be, we have to basically accept two axiomatic principles. No people would or should stand idly by when its people are being bombed and killed. No people should stand idly by or could be expected to and accept 35 years of occupation. Now, I wish the resistance to occupation would be in a different manner. I wish our self-defense would be in a different manner, but the reality is what it is, and that means that within the context of occupation, Israeli policy is always going to be endangering Palestinian babies in the attempt to keep Palestinian suicide bombers out of our cities. And that's why we've come to say that occupation as occupation is a human rights issue. It's, once again, for the politicians perhaps to give the formula of exactly how it must end, but we're going to continue to be in a pool of our own blood, killing each other within the context of occupation. If Rabin had lived, what initiatives of his might have resonated with the Palestinians and to what effect? I think the most important thing, if Rabin had lived, is that there was a certain chemistry that was being built between Israelis and Palestinians, even between Arafat and Rabin. And Rabin had a certain amount of trust of the Israeli people, and things might have been different, but I don't have a crystal ball. What do you hope to see in the next 5 to 10 years in Israel and Palestine? Do you believe that going back to the 67 borders is best? As I said, in Rabbis for Human Rights, we don't talk about whether the border should be here or there in another place. I will say that we are very concerned about the security wall that's being built right now. We have no inherent problem with building a security wall, but where it's being built right now, we're not sure exactly because it keeps on being changed, but it's somewhere between 7 to over 25% of the West Bank is going to be between the wall and the Green Line. In fact, we've been doing a lot of activity planting trees now between the Green Line and the wall, simply because the Israeli government says that this is not a border, but in reality, it is the access for Palestinians to their land between these two lines is very difficult now. What will be in the next 5 to 10 years? I'm usually an optimist. I have to say that the pessimistic side of me has been coming out a lot more since this Intifada began. And I've been saying since it started that it may be 5 to 10 years of violence before we all get tired of killing each other and get back to the negotiating table. I hope I'm wrong. But some people say even that, I'm the optimist still. I don't know. But eventually we will get back to talking with each other. The question is, how long will it take, how many more people will die before we realize that that's the only way? I also want to say one closing remark as Ari is coming up, which is simply, let us not forget, as difficult as the issues may seem, and as challenging as they are, let us not forget that we are on the road to Sinai. And I am always reminded of this wonderful image in the Talmud, where we're taught to look at all of life, both on the personal and cosmic levels, as two evenly balanced scales. And even when we seem to feel that we can't do anything that makes a difference and nothing we can do is effective, we never know what little and seemingly insignificant act at the time may be the act which tips those scales one way or the other. And so my hope and prayer and wish for all of us, whether in all the personal and public and spiritual spheres of our lives, is that we should always have the wisdom and the courage to tip the scales in the right direction.
Amen. So when the prophets gave their tochacha, their rebuke or their self-criticism, they always end with the vision of peace, almost insanely to believe some of the words that we have in our tradition. So Prophet Isaiah said that the redeemed of God will come, and they will return and come to Zion in song with eternal joy over their heads, and fear and hatred will cease, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. And they will return to the city, all who have mourned for her, and all her children, they will live in peace. They will live in peace, and fear and hatred will all pass away, and life and joy will increase. Uftuye Adonai Yeshuvo. yasigu v'nasu yagon v'anachav, and they will return to the city. All who have mourned for heart and fear and hatred will all pass away, and life and joy increase. V'nasu yagon v'anachav, v'nasu yagon v'anachav. Probably a lot of you know the song, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, peace will yet come upon us, Aleinu V'al Kol Ha'olam, upon us and all the world. So please join me if you know the words. Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, V'yal Lekulam. Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, V'yal Lekulam. Salam Aleinu V'yal Kol Ha'olam. Salam, salam. Shalom Aleinu V'yal Kol Ha'olam. Shalom, shalom. Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, V'yal Lekulam. Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, V'yal Lekulam. Salam Aleinu V'yal Kol Ha'olam. Salam, salam. Shalom Aleinu V'yal Kol Ha'olam. Shalom, shalom. Shalom Aleinu V'yal Kol Ha'olam. Shalom, shalom. Amen.
You've been listening to Executive Director of Rabbis for Human Rights, Rabbi Arik Ascherman, speaking at the Neve Shalom Synagogue in Portland, Oregon, on May 5, 2003. To find out more about Rabbis for Human Rights, please visit their website at rhr.israel.net. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find programs featuring speakers such as Amira Haas, Diana Butu, Jeff Halper, Rashid Khalidi, Paul Krugman, Phyllis Bennis, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.
There is a wide and full opportunity for people to express opinions, and many Israelis share many of the values and ideas that I'm going to speak about tonight. Most of them tend to be secular, whereas in the religious community, for a variety of historical and sociological reasons, and this was not always the case, but increasingly people have been socialized into a somewhat volatile mixture of extreme nationalism and particularism. One of our rabbis, his daughter went to B'nai Akiva, one of the Orthodox youth movements, and she met her husband-to-be when there was a vaguely liberal speaker, and they were the only two people that clapped their hands at the end. And that's how they met each other. So that in Rabbis for Human Rights, if our first mandate is to address and redress human rights abuses, then our second and no less important mandate is to introduce into people's intellectual universe, not only in the religious community, but also in the secular community, where many people assume that this nationalistic, particularistic brand of Judaism is the sole authentic brand of Judaism, because that's what they see reflected by the people who for them are the authentic representatives of religious Judaism, to introduce into people's intellectual universe that alongside this dominant understanding of Torah, there is an equally Jewish, equally textually based, humanistic, equally authentic humanistic understanding of Torah. One of my clearest memories from my first year working for Rabbis for Human Rights back in '95 is in December, just a month after Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. And we went for a morning of study at a yeshiva in the occupied territories by the name of Birkat Yosef. The Birkat Yosef is headed by a rabbi who had been quoted on the radio as saying that bombs should be placed on the side of the road to prevent withdrawals from territory. And he's one of the Thank you. I also want to point out that we have sitting over here Nava Chefetz, our educational director, who does wonderful work for us in the educational field, and perhaps she might be tempted to answer some of the questions also later on. We are, this evening, Erev Yom HaZikaron, our Israeli Day of Remembrance. We're also here in the period of Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer, also a time of semi-mourning, but not only, because the time of the Omer is a time that we count the days from leaving Egypt, which we celebrated on Passover, to Matan Torah, till the time that we receive the tablets at Mount Sinai. And what we're here to talk about tonight is Torah. And we're here to talk about what it is that we as Jews believe and stand for, what we as rabbis swore to uphold when we were ordained. Now, of course, we're also told Shivim Panim LaTorah, there are 70 facets to the Torah. There are even those who say that at Mount Sinai, each and every person heard something a little different. And so, when we talk about upholding Torah, different people see that in different ways. But the Torah that I learned growing up in Erie, Pennsylvania, was a Torah that said a basic part of what it means to be a Jew is to be concerned with universal human rights. Rabbis who was suspected, and I really underline the word suspected. I don't know how many journalists and lawyers we have here, but suspected. It was never proven, and he denies it. But had been suspected of being one of the rabbis who had given a halachic, a Jewish legal backing for the assassination. And so we spent the morning studying with the students, and then we had a round table with the students and ourselves and Rabbi Rabinovich. And one of the first things that he needed to say was just what seems so basic to all of us. What is it that we learn in the very first verses of Genesis, of Sefer Breshit? That all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image, and that therefore Judaism cannot and must not condone the oppression or humiliation or mistreatment of any human being. But then we started talking about details, and then we got into trouble. So we were talking about some things going on in the Hebron area at the time of oppression of Palestinians by settlers or by soldiers. And Rabbi Rabinovich was saying, you haven't seen it yourselves. Unfortunately, we had. You're getting it from second and third hand sources, etc., etc. And then one of Rabbi Rabinovich's own students stood up. And he said, Avakvod Alav, but Rabbi, when I was doing my army service in Hebron, I saw it with my own eyes. Now, of course, at that point you could have heard a pin drop. And I wish I could tell you the end of the story was they all signed up that day to be members of Rabbis for Human Rights. It didn't quite happen that way. But that student did come to see us again, and I think we did introduce into people's intellectual universe, as I said, another way of understanding Torah. Rabbis for Human Rights was founded during the first Intifada. In fact, many of Israel's current human rights organizations, ourselves, B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights, Workers' Hotline, and many others, were all founded during that period because when the orders had gone out to put down that first Intifada by breaking bones, there were many people who simply felt that red lines had been crossed. And particularly among our colleagues, rabbinic colleagues, many people who hadn't been particularly political or activist or left-wing simply felt that there was a need for a Jewish rabbinic response to what was happening in our society. And our founder, Rabbi David Foreman, wrote an open letter saying to the chief rabbinate saying, why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned with Sabbath observance and kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws? These things are, of course, very important. But where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels running around this country and crying Gewalt and speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society? For those of you from the name of Rabbi Heschel does not ring a bell, he, of course, was a descendant of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent most of his career at the Jewish Theological Seminary, wrote wonderful books on Jewish philosophy and history, and people should read those books. But he didn't just stay in the ivory tower. He was one of the first people to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He was one of the people behind the scenes that led to Vatican II. He was very active in the struggle against the Vietnam War and on behalf of civil rights. And he, in many ways, is our role model of a rabbi and scholar who is also a social activist. And as I said, this call struck a chord for many, many, many rabbis. And we quickly became, unfortunately to this day, we are still the only rabbinic organization in Israel in which rabbis from the different streams of Judaism, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Renewal, all coexist in one organization without strangling each other. And so I understand from the response that people understand that in Israel that's no small feat. That of course, just for that we should get some brownie points somewhere, because in some ways the gaps between different Jewish groups in Israel are at least as wide as those between Jews and Palestinians. In fact, it was so unusual at that time in social justice. This is what I learned from my family, from my teachers, from my rabbis, from the community. And I think that's something that imagine a lot of you here, those of you who are from the Jewish community, can identify with. I think it's a piece of what our ethos is as North American Jews. In fact, one of the most interesting findings of the most recent North American Jewish population survey, I'm sure many of you know, is that of all the different possible measures of Jewish identity, that aspect which with more Jews in North America identify with than anything else, which give more Jews in North America pride in their Judaism than anything else, is the connection between Judaism and social justice. And so I think we can have our quibbles and quabbles about the right balance between universalism and particularism. We have people that talk the talk without walking the walk. And of course, once we start talking about Israel, as we will tonight, then everybody's buttons get pushed. But whether you're talking about Erie, Pennsylvania, or Brooklyn, New York, I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find many people in the North American Jewish community who would dispute the proposition that these are core Jewish values. And so when I first spent some significant amount of time in Israel, my first greatest shock, and I'm dating myself a bit here, was to find out that bagels were not readily available. What kind of Jewish state is this without bagels? No problem anymore. But the second greatest shock was to find out that many people in the Israeli community did not necessarily see these values of justice and human rights as axiomatic in the same way that I had learned, particularly in the religious community. You know that Israel is a very lively democracy. We had some 27 parties in the last election, each of them getting state-funded television time.